Why Jackson should have preferred the Presbyterian denomination to all others we are nowhere told. But whatever his reasons may have been, he was a most zealous and hard-working member of his church. He was not content with perfunctory attendances at the services. He became a deacon, and a large portion of his leisure time was devoted to the work which thus devolved on him. His duties were to collect alms and to distribute to the destitute, and nothing was permitted to interfere with their exact performance. He was exceedingly charitable himself. 1/10 of his income was laid aside for the church, and he gave freely to all causes of benevolence and public enterprise. At the church meetings, whether for business or prayer, he was a regular attendant, and between himself and his pastor existed the most confidential relations. Nor did he consider that this was all that was demanded of him. In Lexington, as in other southern towns, there were many poor Negroes, and the condition of these ignorant and helpless creatures, especially of the children, excited his compassion. Out of his own means he established a Sunday school, in which he and his wife were the principal teachers. His friends were asked to send their slaves, and the experiment was successful. The benches were always crowded, and the rows of black, bright-eyed faces were a source of as much pride to him as the martial appearance of the cadet battalion. Jackson's religion entered into every action of his life. No duty, however trivial, was begun without asking a blessing or ended without returning thanks. He had long cultivated, he said, the habit of connecting the most trivial and customary acts of life with a silent prayer. He took the Bible as his guide, and it is possible that his literal interpretation of its precepts caused many to regard him as a fanatic. His observance of the Sabbath was hardly in accordance with ordinary usage. He never read a letter on that day, nor posted one. He believed that the government, in carrying the mails, were violating a divine law, and he considered the suppression of such traffic one of the most important duties of the legislature. Such opinions were uncommon, even amongst the Presbyterians, and his rigid respect for truth served to strengthen the impression that he was morbidly scrupulous. If he unintentionally made a misstatement, even about some trifling matter, as soon as he discovered his mistake, he would lose no time and spare no trouble in hastening to correct it. "Why, in the name of reason," he was asked, "do you walk a mile in the rain for a perfectly unimportant thing?" "Simply because I have discovered that it was a misstatement, and I could not sleep comfortably unless I put it right." He had occasion to censure a cadet who had given, as Jackson believed, the wrong solution of a problem. On thinking the matter over at home, he found that the pupil was right and the teacher wrong. It was late at night and in the depth of winter, but he immediately started off to the institute, some distance from his quarters, and sent for the cadet. The delinquent, answering with much trepidation the untimely summons, found himself to his astonishment the recipient of a frank apology. Jackson's scruples carried him even further. Persons who interlarded their conversation with the unmeaning phrase, "you know," were often astonished by the blunt interruption that he did not know, and when he was entreated at parties or receptions to break through his dietary rules, and for courtesy's sake to accept some delicacy, he would always refuse with the reply that he had no genius for seeming. But if he carried his conscientiousness to extremes, if he laid down stringent rules for his own governance, he neither set himself up for a model, nor did he attempt to force his convictions upon others. He was always tolerant, he knew his own faults and his own temptations, and if he could say nothing good of a man, he would not speak of him at all. But he was by no means disposed to overlook conduct of which he disapproved, and undue leniency was a weakness to which he never yielded. If he once lost confidence or discovered deception on the part of one he trusted, he withdrew himself as far as possible from any further dealings with him, and whether with the cadets or with his brother officers, if an offence had been committed of which he was called upon to take notice, he was absolutely inflexible. Punishment or report inevitably followed. No excuses, no personal feelings, no appeals to the suffering which might be brought upon the innocent were permitted to interfere with the execution of his duty. Such were the chief characteristics of the great Confederate as he appeared to the little world of Lexington. The tall figure, clad in the blue uniform of the United States Army, always scrupulously neat, striding to and from the Institute, or standing in the center of the parade ground, while the cadet battalion wheeled and deployed at his command, was familiar to the whole community. But Jackson's heart was not worn on his sleeve. Shy and silent as he was, the knowledge that even his closest acquaintances had of him was hardly more than superficial. A man who was always chary of expressing his opinions unless they were asked for, who declined argument and used as few words as possible, attracted but little notice. A few recognized his clear good sense. The majority considered that if he said little, it was because he had nothing worth saying. Because he went his own way and lived by his own rules, he was considered eccentric. Because he was sometimes absent-minded and apt to become absorbed in his own thoughts, he was set down as unpractical. His literal accuracy of statement was construed as the mark of a narrow intellect, and his exceeding modesty served to keep him in the background. At the Institute, despite his reputation for courage, he was no favorite even with the cadets. He was hardly in sympathy with them. His temper was always equable. Whatever he may have felt, he never betrayed irritation, and in the lecture room or elsewhere he was kindness itself. But his own life had been filled from boyhood with earnest purpose and high ambition. Hard work was more to his taste than amusement. Time, to his mind, was far too valuable to be wasted, and he made few allowances for the thoughtlessness and indolence of irresponsible youth. As a relief possibly to the educational treadmill, his class delighted in listening to the story of Contreras and Chapultepec, but there was nothing about Jackson which corresponded with a boy's idea of a hero. His aggressive punctuality, his strict observance of military etiquette, his precise interpretation of orders, seemed to have as little in common with the fierce excitement of battle as the uninteresting occupations of the Presbyterian deacon, who kept a Sunday school for Negroes, had with the reckless gaiety of the traditional sabreur. And yet, says one who know him, they imbibed the principles he taught. Slowly and certainly were they trained in the direction which the teacher wished. Jackson justly believed that the chief value of the Institute consisted in the habits of system and obedience which it impressed on the ductile characters of the cadets, and regarded any relaxation of the rules as tending to destroy its usefulness. His conscientiousness seemed absurd to the young gentleman who had no idea of the importance of military orders or of the implicit obedience which a good soldier deems it his duty to pay to them. But which was right, the laughing young cadet or the grave major of artillery? Let the thousands who in the bitter and arduous struggle of the Civil War were taught by stern experience the necessity of strict compliance with all orders, to the very letter, answer the question. As exact as the multiplication table, and as full of things military as an arsenal, was the verdict passed on Jackson by one of his townsmen, and it appears to have been the opinion of the community at large. Jackson, indeed, was as inarticulate as Cromwell. Like the great Protector, he lived silent, and like him, he was often misunderstood. Stories which have been repeated by writer after writer attribute to him the most grotesque eccentricities of manner, and exhibit his lofty piety as the harsh intolerance of a fanatic. He has been represented as the narrowest of Calvinists, and so general was the belief in his stern and merciless nature that a great poet did not scruple to link his name with a deed which, had it actually occurred, would have been one of almost unexampled cruelty. Such calumnies as Whittier's Barbara Frichti may possibly have found their source in the impression made upon some of Jackson's acquaintances at Lexington, who, out of all sympathy with his high ideal of life and duty, regarded him as morose and morbid, and when, in after years, the fierce and relentless pursuit of the Confederate general piled the dead high upon the battlefield, this conception of his character was readily accepted. As he rose to fame, men listened greedily to those who could speak of him from personal knowledge. The anecdotes which they related were quickly distorted. The slightest peculiarities of walk, speech, or gesture were greatly exaggerated. and even Virginians seemed to vie with one another in representing the humble and kind-hearted soldier as the most bigoted of Christians and the most pitiless of men. But just as the majority of ridiculous stories which cluster round his name rest on the very flimsiest foundation, so the popular conception of his character during his life at Lexington was absolutely erroneous. It was only within the portals of his home that his real nature disclosed itself. The simple and pathetic pages in which his widow has recorded the story of their married life unfold an almost ideal picture of domestic happiness, uncheckered by the faintest glimpse of austerity or gloom. That quiet home was the abode of much content. The sunshine of sweet temper flooded every nook and corner, and although the pervading atmosphere was essentially religious, mirth and laughter were familiar guests. Those who knew General Jackson only as they saw him in public would have found it hard to believe that there could be such a transformation as he exhibited in his domestic life. He luxuriated in the freedom and liberty of his home, and his buoyancy and joyousness often ran into a playfulness and abandon that would have been incredible to those who saw him only when he put on his official dignity. It was seldom, indeed, except under his own roof or in the company of his intimates, that his reserve was broken through. In society he was always on his guard, fearful lest any chance word might be misconstrued or give offence. It is no wonder, then, that Lexington misjudged him. Nor were those who knew him only when he was absorbed in the cares of command before the enemy likely to see far below the surface. The dominant trait in Jackson's character was his intense earnestness, and when work was doing, every faculty of his nature was engrossed in the accomplishment of the task on hand. But precise, methodical, and matter-of-fact as he appeared, his was no commonplace and prosaic nature. He had the delicacy and the tenderness which are the rarest and most beautiful ornament of the strong. Beneath his habitual gravity, a vivid imagination, restrained indeed by strong sense and indulging in no vain visions, was ever at work. And a lofty enthusiasm, which seldom betrayed itself in words, inspired his whole being. He was essentially chivalrous. His deference to woman, even in a land where such deference was still the fashion, was remarkable, and his sympathy with the oppressed was as deep as his loyalty to Virginia. He was an ardent lover of nature. The autumnal glories of the forest, the songs of the birds, the splendours of the sunset, were sources of unfailing pleasure. More than all, the strength of his imagination carried him further than the confines of the material world, and he saw with unclouded vision the radiant heights that lie beyond. Jackson, then, was something more than a man of virile temperament. He was gifted with other qualities than energy, determination, and common sense. He was not witty. He had no talent for repartee, and the most industrious collector of anecdotes will find few good things attributed to him. But he possessed a kindly humour, which found vent in playful expressions of endearment, or in practical jokes of the most innocent description, and if these outbursts of high spirits were confined to the precincts of his own home, they proved at least that neither by temperament nor principle was he inclined to look upon the darker side. His eye for a ludicrous situation was very quick, and a joke which told against himself always caused him the most intense amusement. It is impossible to read the letters which Mrs. Jackson has published, and to entertain the belief that his temper was ever in the least degree morose. To use her own words, they are the overflow of a heart full of tenderness. It is true that they seldom omit some reference to that higher life which both husband and wife were striving hand in hand to lead, but they are instinct from first to last with the serene happiness of a contented mind. Even more marked than his habitual cheerfulness was his almost feminine sympathy with the poor and feeble. His servants, as was the universal rule in Virginia, were his slaves, but his relations with his black dependents were of almost a paternal character, and his kindness was repaid by that childlike devotion peculiar to the Negro race. More than one of these servants, so great was his reputation for kindness, had begged him to buy them from their former owners. Their interests were his special care. In sickness they received all the attention and comfort that the house afforded. To his favourite virtues, politeness and punctuality, They were trained by their master himself, and their moral education was a task he cheerfully undertook. "There was one little servant in the family," says Mrs. Jackson, "whom my husband took under his sheltering roof at the solicitations of an aged lady, to whom the child became a care after having been left an orphan. She was not bright, but he persevered in drilling her into memorizing a child's catechism, and it was a most amusing picture to see her standing before him with fixed attention, as if she were straining every nerve, and reciting her answers with the drop of a curtsy at each word. She had not been taught to do this, but it was such an effort for her to learn that she assumed the motion involuntarily." Jackson's home was childless. A little daughter, born at Lexington, lived only for a few weeks, and her place remained unfilled. His sorrow, although he submitted uncomplainingly, was very bitter, for his love for children was very great. "A gentleman," says Mrs. Jackson, "who spent the night with us was accompanied by his daughter, but 4 years of age. It was the first time the child had been separated from her mother, and my husband suggested that she should be committed to my care during the night, but she clung to her father. After our guests had both sunk in slumber, the father was aroused by someone leaning over his little girl and drawing the covering more closely round her. It was only his thoughtful host, who felt anxious lest his little guest should miss her mother's guardian care under his roof, and could not go to sleep himself until he was satisfied that all was well with the child. These incidents are little more than trivial. The attributes they reveal seem of small import. They are not such as go towards building up a successful career either in war or politics, and yet to arrive at a true conception of Jackson's character, it is necessary that such incidents should be recorded. That character will not appear the less admirable, because its strength and energy were tempered by softer virtues, and when we remember the great soldier teaching a Negro child or ministering to the comfort of a sick slave, it becomes easy to understand the feelings with which his veterans regarded him. The quiet home at Lexington reveals more of the real man than the camps and conflicts of the Civil War, and no picture of Stonewall Jackson would be complete without some reference to his domestic life. "His life at home," says his wife, "was perfectly regular and systematic. He arose about 6 o'clock and first knelt in secret prayer. Then he took a cold bath, which was never omitted even in the coldest days of winter. This was followed by a brisk walk in rain or shine. 7 o'clock was the hour for family prayers, which he required all his servants to attend promptly and regularly. He never waited for anyone, not even his wife. Breakfast followed prayers, after which he left immediately for the Institute, his classes opening at 8 o'clock and continuing to 11. Upon his return home at 11 o'clock, he devoted himself to study until 1. The first book he took up daily was his Bible, which he read with a commentary, and the many pencil marks upon it showed with what care he bent over its pages. From his Bible lesson he turned to his textbooks. During those hours of study he would permit no interruption, and stood all the time in front of a high desk. After dinner he gave himself up for half an hour or more to leisure and conversation, and this was one of the brightest periods in his home life. He then went into his garden or out to his farm to superintend his servants, and frequently joined them in manual labour. He would often drive me to the farm and find a shady spot for me under the trees while he attended to the work of the field. When this was not the case, he always returned in time to take me, if the weather permitted, for an evening walk or drive. In summer we often took our drives by moonlight, and in the beautiful valley of Virginia the Queen of Night seemed to shine with more brightness than elsewhere. When at home he would indulge himself in a season of rest and recreation after supper, thinking it was injurious to health to go to work immediately. As it was a rule with him never to use his eyes by artificial light, he formed the habit of studying mentally for an hour or so without a book. After going over his lessons in the morning, he thus reviewed them at night, and in order to abstract his thoughts from surrounding objects, a habit which he had cultivated to a remarkable degree, he would, if alone with his wife, ask that he might not be disturbed by any conversation. He would then take his seat with his face to the wall and remain in perfect abstraction until he finished his mental task. He was very fond of being read to, and much of our time in the evening was passed in my ministering to him in this way. He had a library, which, though small, was select, composed chiefly of scientific, historical, and religious books, with some of a lighter character, and some in Spanish and French. Nearly all of them were full of his pencil marks, made with a view to future reference. Next to the Bible, history, both ancient and modern, was his favourite study. Plutarch, Josephus, Rollin, Robertson, Hallam, Macaulay, and Bancroft were his constant companions. Shakespeare held an honoured place upon his shelves, and when a novel fell into his hands, he became so absorbed in the story that he eventually avoided such literature as a waste of time. "I am anxious," he wrote to a relative, "to devote myself to study until I shall become master of my profession." The Jacksons were far from affluent. The professor had nothing but his salary, and his wife, one of a large family, brought no increase to their income. But the traditional hospitality of Virginia was a virtue by no means neglected. He was generous but unostentatious in his mode of living, and nothing gave him more pleasure than to bid his friends welcome to his own home. His outdoor recreations were healthful but not exciting. The hills round Lexington teemed with game, the rivers with fish, and shooting and fishing were the favourite amusements of his colleagues. But Jackson found no pleasure in rod or gun, and although fond of riding and a good horseman, he never appears to have joined in any of those equestrian sports to which the Virginians were much addicted. He neither followed the hunt nor tilted at the ring. His exercise was taken after more utilitarian fashion, in the garden or the farm. It need hardly be said that such a lover of order and method was strictly economical, and the wise administration of the farm and household permitted an annual expenditure on travel. Many of the most beautiful localities and famous cities of the East and North were visited in these excursions. Sometimes he wandered with his wife in search of health. More often the object of their journey was to see with their own eyes the splendid scenery of their native land. The associations, which were ever connected in Jackson's mind with his tour through Europe, show how intensely he appreciated the marvels both of nature and of art. "I would advise you," he wrote to a friend, "never to name my European trip to me unless you are blessed with a superabundance of patience, as its very mention is calculated to bring up with it an almost inexhaustible assemblage of grand and beautiful associations. Passing over the works of the Creator, which are far the most impressive, it is difficult to conceive of the influences which even the works of his creatures exercise over the mind of one who lingers amidst their master productions. Well do I remember the influence of sculpture upon me during my short stay in Florence, and how there I began to realize the sentiment of the Florentine. Take from me my liberty, take what you will, but leave me my statuary, leave me these entrancing productions of art." And similar to this is the influence of painting. But delightful as were these holiday expeditions, the day of Jackson's return to Lexington and his duties never came too soon. In the quiet routine of his home life, in his work at the Institute, in the supervision of his farm and garden, in his evenings with his books, and in the services of his church, he was more than contented. Whatever remained of soldierly ambition had long been eradicated. Man of action, as he essentially was, he evinced no longing for a wider sphere of intellectual activity, or for a more active existence. Under his own roof-tree he found all that he desired. "There," says his wife, "all that was best in his nature shone forth, and that temper was surely of the sweetest which could utter no sterner rebuke than, 'Ah, that is not the way to be happy.' Nor was it merely his own gentleness of disposition and the many graces of his charming helpmate that secured so large a degree of peace and happiness. Jackson's religion played even a greater part. It was not of the kind which is more concerned with the terrors of hell than the glories of paradise. The world to him was no place of woe and lamentation, its beauties vanity, and its affections a snare. As he gazed with delight on the gorgeous tints of the autumnal forests, and the lovely landscapes of his mountain home, so he enjoyed to the utmost the life and love which had fallen to his lot, and thanked God for that capacity for happiness with which his nature was so largely gifted. Yet it cannot be said that he practiced no self-denial. His life, in many respects, was one of constant self-discipline, and when his time came to sacrifice himself, he submitted without a murmur. But in his creed, fear had no place. His faith was great. It was not, however, a mere belief in God's omnipotence and God's justice, but a deep and abiding confidence in his infinite compassion and infinite love, and it created in him an almost startling consciousness of the nearness and reality of the invisible world. In a letter to his wife, it is revealed in all its strength. "You must not be discouraged at the slowness of recovery. Look up to him who giveth liberally for faith to be resigned to his divine will, and trust him for that measure of health which will most glorify him, and advance to the greatest extent your own real happiness. We are sometimes suffered to be in a state of perplexity, that our faith may be tried and grow stronger. See if you cannot spend a short time after dark in looking out of your window into space and meditating upon heaven, with all its joys unspeakable and full of glory. All things work together for good to God's children. Try to look up and be cheerful and not desponding. Trust our kind Heavenly Father, and by the eye of faith see that all things are right and for your best interests. The clouds come, pass over us, and are followed by bright sunshine. So in God's moral dealings with us, he permits to have trouble a while. But let us, even in the most trying dispensations of his providence, be cheered by the brightness which is a little ahead. It would serve no useful purpose to discuss Jackson's views on controversial questions. It may be well, however, to correct a common error. It has been asserted that he was a fatalist and therefore careless of a future over which he believed he had no control. Not a word, however, either in his letters or in his recorded conversations, warrants the assumption. It is true that his favourite maxim was, "Duty is ours, consequences are God's," and that knowing all things work together for good, he looked forward to the future without misgiving or apprehension. But nonetheless he believed implicitly that the destiny of men and of nations is in their own hands. His faith was as sane as it was humble, without a touch of that presumptuous fanaticism which stains the memory of Cromwell, to whom he has been so often compared. He never imagined, even at the height of his renown, when victory on victory crowned his banners, that he was the scourge of God, the chosen instrument of his vengeance. He prayed without ceasing, under fire as in the camp, but he never mistook his own impulse for a revelation of the divine will. He prayed for help to do his duty, and he prayed for success. He knew that. More things are wrought by prayer than this world dreams of, but he knew also that prayer is not always answered in the way which man would have it. He went into battle with supreme confidence, not, as has been alleged, that the Lord had delivered the enemy into his hands, but that whatever happened would be the best that could happen. And he was as free from cant as from self-deception. It may be said of Jackson, as has been said so eloquently of the men whom in some respects he closely resembled, that his Bible was literally food to his understanding and a guide to his conduct. He saw the visible finger of God in every incident of life. That which in our day devout men and women feel in their earnest moments of prayer, the devout Puritan felt, as a second nature, in his rising up and in his lying down, in the marketplace and in the home, in society and in business, in Parliament, in council, and on the field of battle. And feeling this, the Puritan had no shame in uttering the very words of the Bible, wherein he had learned so to feel. Nay, he would have burned with shame had he faltered in using the words. It is very hard for us now to grasp what this implies. But there was a generation in which this phraseology was the natural speech of men. Of this generation, although later in time, was Stonewall Jackson. To him such language as he used in his letters to his wife, in conversation with his intimates, and not rarely in his official correspondence, was the literal assertion of truths which he felt to the roots of his being, which absorbed his thoughts, which coloured every action of his life, and which, from the abundance of his heart, rose most naturally to his lips. There is no need for further allusion to his domestic or religious life. If in general society Jackson was wanting in geniality, if he was so little a man of the world that his example lost much of the influence which, had he stood less aloof from others, it must have exercised, it was the fruit of his early training, his natural reserve, and his extreme humility. It is impossible, however, that so pure a life should have been altogether without reflex upon others. If the cadets profited but indirectly, the slaves had cause to bless his practical Christianity. The poor and the widow knew him as a friend, and his neighbours looked up to him as the soul of sincerity, the enemy of all that was false and vile. And for himself, what share had those years of quiet study, of self-communing, and of self-discipline in shaping the triumphs of the Confederate arms? The story of his military career is the reply. Men of action have before now deplored the incessant press of business which leaves them no leisure to think out the problems which may confront them in the future. Experience is of little value without reflection, and leisure has its disadvantages. One can comprehend, says Dabney, referring to Jackson's peculiar form of mental exercise, how valuable was the training which his mind received for his work as a soldier. Command over his attention was formed into a habit which no tempest of confusion could disturb. His power of abstraction became unrivalled. His imagination was trained and invigorated until it became capable of grouping the most extensive and complex considerations. The power of his mind was drilled like the strength of an athlete, and his self-concentration became unsurpassed. Such training was undoubtedly the very best foundation for the intellectual side of a general's business. War presents a constant succession of problems to be solved by mental processes. For some experience and resource supply a ready solution. Others, involving the movements of large bodies, considerations of time and space, and the 1,001 circumstances, such as food, weather, roads, topography, and morale, which a general must always bear in mind, are composed of so many factors that only a brain accustomed to hard thinking can deal with them successfully. Of this nature are the problems of strategy, those which confront a general in command of an army or of a detached portion of an army, and which are worked out on the map. The problems of the battlefield are of a different order. The natural characteristics which, when fortified by experience, carry men through any dangerous enterprise, win the majority of victories. But men may win battles and be very poor generals. They may be born leaders of men, and yet absolutely unfitted for independent command. Their courage, coolness, and common sense may accomplish the enemy's overthrow on the field, but with strategical considerations, their intellects may be absolutely incapable of grappling. In the great wars of the early part of the century, Ney and Blücher were probably the best fighting generals of France and Prussia. But neither could be trusted to conduct a campaign. Blücher, preeminent on the battlefield, knew nothing of the grand combinations which prepare and complete success. If he was the strong right hand of the Prussian army, his chief of staff was the brain. "Gneisenau," said the old marshal, "makes the pills which I administer." Ney's best qualities, says Jomini, who served long on his staff, his heroic valour, his quick coup d'œil, and his energy, diminished in the same proportion that the extent of his command increased his responsibility. Admirable on the field of battle, he displayed less assurance, not only in council, but whenever he was not actually face to face with the enemy. It is not of such material as Ney and Blücher, mistrustful of their own ability, that great captains are made. Marked intellectual capacity is the chief characteristic of the most famous soldiers. Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Marlborough, Washington, Frederick, Napoleon, Wellington and Nelson were each and all of them something more than mere fighting men. Few of their age rivaled them in strength of intellect. It was this, combined with the best qualities of Ney and Blücher, that made them masters of strategy, and lifted them high above those who were tacticians and nothing more. and it was strength of intellect that Jackson cultivated at Lexington. So, in that quiet home amidst the Virginian mountains, the years sped by, peaceful and uneventful, varied only by the holiday excursions of successive summers. By day, the lecture at the Institute, the drill of the cadet battery, the work of the church, the pleasant toil of the farm and garden. When night fell, and the curtains were drawn across the windows that looked upon the quiet street, there in that home where order reigned supreme, where, as the master wished, each door turned softly on a golden hinge, came those hours of thought and analysis which were to fit him for great deeds. The even tenor of this calm existence was broken, however, by an incident which intensified the bitter feeling which already divided the northern and southern sections of the United States. During the month of January 1859, Jackson had marched with the cadet battalion to Harper's Ferry, where, on the northern frontier of Virginia, the fanatic John Brown had attempted to raise an insurrection amongst the Negroes, and had been hung after trial in presence of the troops. By the South, Brown was regarded as a madman and a murderer. By many in the North he was glorified as a martyr. And so acute was the tension that early in 1860, during a short absence from Lexington, Jackson wrote in a letter to his wife, "What do you think about the state of the country? Viewing things at Washington from human appearances, I think we have great reason for alarm." A great crisis was indeed at hand. But if to her, who was ever beside him, while the storm clouds were rising dark and terrible over the fair skies of the prosperous republic, the Christian soldier seemed the man best fitted to lead the people, it was not so outside. None doubted his sincerity or questioned his resolution, but few had penetrated his reserve. As the playful tenderness he displayed at home was never suspected, so the consuming earnestness, the absolute fearlessness, whether of danger or of responsibility, the utter disregard of man, and the unquestioning faith in the Almighty, which made up the individuality which men called Stonewall Jackson, remained hidden from all but one. To his wife his inward graces idealized his outward seeming, but others, noting his peculiarities, and deceived by his modesty, saw little that was remarkable, and much that was singular in the staid professor. Few detected, beneath that quiet demeanour and absent manner, the existence of energy incarnate and an iron will. And still fewer beheld, in the plain figure of the Presbyterian deacon, the potential leader of great armies, inspiring the devotion of his soldiers and riding in the forefront of victorious battle. Chapter 4. Secession, 1860–61. 1861. Jackson spent 10 years at Lexington, and he was just 35 when he left it. For 10 years he had seen no more of military service than the drills of the cadet battalion. He had lost all touch with the army. His name had been forgotten, except by his comrades of the Mexican campaign, and he had hardly seen a regular soldier since he resigned his commission. But, even from a military point of view, those 10 years had not been wasted. His mind had a wider grasp, and his brain was more active. Striving to fit himself for such duties as might devolve on him should he be summoned to the field, like all great men and all practical men, he had gone to the best masters. In the campaigns of Napoleon, he had found instruction in the highest branch of his profession, and had made his own the methods of war which the greatest of modern soldiers both preached and practiced. Maturer years and the search for wisdom had steadied his restless daring, and his devotion to duty, always remarkable, had become a second nature. His health, under careful and self-imposed treatment, had much improved, and the year 1861 found him in the prime of physical and mental vigour. Already it had become apparent that his life at Lexington was soon to end. The Damascus blade was not to rust upon the shelf. During the winter of 1860–61, the probability of a conflict between the free and slave-holding states, that is, between North and South, had become almost a certainty. South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had formally seceded from the Union, and establishing a provisional government with Jefferson Davis as president at Montgomery in Alabama, had proclaimed a new republic under the title of the Confederate States of America. In order to explain Jackson's attitude at this momentous crisis, it will be necessary to discuss the action of Virginia and to investigate the motives which led her to take the side she did. Forces which it was impossible to curb, and which but few detected, were at the root of the secession movement. The ostensible cause was the future status of the Negro. Slavery was recognized in 15 states of the Union. In the North it had long been abolished, but this made no difference to its existence in the South. The states which composed the Union were semi-independent communities, with their own legislatures, their own magistracies, their own militia, and the power of the purse. How far their sovereign rights extended was a matter of contention, but under the terms of the Constitution, slavery was a domestic institution which each individual state was at liberty to retain or discard at will, and over which the federal government had no control whatever. Congress would have been no more justified in declaring that the slaves in Virginia were free men than in demanding that Russian conspirators should be tried by jury. Nor was the philanthropy of the Northern people, generally speaking, of an enthusiastic nature. The majority regarded slavery as a necessary evil, and, if they deplored the reproach to the Republic, they made little parade of their sentiments. A large number of Southerners believed it to be the happiest condition for the African race, but the best men, especially in the border states, of which Virginia was the principal, would have welcomed emancipation. But neither Northerner nor Southerner saw a practicable method of giving freedom to the Negro. Such a measure, if carried out in its entirety, meant ruin to the South. Cotton and tobacco, the principal and most lucrative crops, required an immense number of hands, and in those hands, his Negro slaves, the capital of the planter was locked up. Emancipation would have swept the whole of this capital away. Compensation, the remedy applied by England to Jamaica and South Africa, was hardly to be thought of. Instead of 20 millions sterling, it would have cost 400 millions. It was doubtful, too, if compensation would have staved off the ruin of the planters. The labour of the free Negro, naturally indolent and improvident, was well known to be most inefficient as compared with that of the slave. For some years, to say the least, after emancipation it would have been impossible to work the plantations except at a heavy loss. Moreover, abolition, in the judgment of all who knew him, meant ruin to the Negro. Under the system of the plantations, honesty and morality were being gradually instilled into the coloured race. But these virtues had as yet made little progress. The Christianity of the slaves was but skin deep, and if all restraint were removed, if the old ties were broken, and the influence of the planter and his family should cease to operate, it was only too probable that the 4 millions of Africans would relapse into the barbaric vices of their original condition. The hideous massacres which had followed emancipation in San Domingo had not yet been forgotten. It is little wonder, then, that the majority shrank before a problem involving such tremendous consequences. A party, however, conspicuous both in New England and the West, had taken abolition for its watchword. Small in numbers, but vehement in denunciation, its voice was heard throughout the Union. Zeal for universal liberty rose superior to the Constitution. That instrument was repudiated as an iniquitous document. The sovereign rights of the individual states were indignantly denied. Slavery was denounced as the sum of all villainies, the slaveholder as the worst of tyrants, and no concealment was made of the intention, should political power be secured, of compelling the South to set the Negroes free. In the autumn of 1860 came the presidential election. Hitherto, of the two great political parties, the Democrats had long ruled the councils of the nation, and nearly the whole South was Democratic. The South, as regards population, was numerically inferior to the North, but the Democratic Party had more than held its own at the ballot boxes, for the reason that it had many adherents in the North. So long as the Southern and Northern Democrats held together, they far outnumbered the Republicans. In 1860, however, the two sections of the Democratic Party split asunder. The Republicans, favored by the schism, carried their own candidate, and Abraham Lincoln became president. South Carolina at once seceded, and the Confederacy was soon afterwards established. It is not at first sight apparent why a change of government should have caused so sudden a disruption of the Union. The Republican Party, however, embraced sections of various shades of thought. One of these, rising every day to greater prominence, was that which advocated immediate abolition, and to this section, designated by the South as Black Republicans, the new president was believed to belong. It is possible that on his advent to office, the political leaders of the South, despite the safeguards of the Constitution, saw in the near future the unconditional emancipation of the slaves, and not only this, but that the emancipated slaves would receive the right of suffrage and be placed on a footing of complete equality with their former masters. As in many districts the whites were far outnumbered by the Negroes, this was tantamount to transferring all local government into the hands of the latter and surrendering the planters to the mercies of their former bondsmen. It is hardly necessary to say that an act of such gross injustice was never contemplated, except by hysterical abolitionists and those who truckled for their votes. It was certainly not contemplated by Mr. Lincoln, and it was hardly likely that a president who had been elected by a minority of the people would dare, even if he were so inclined, to assume unconstitutional powers. The Democratic Party, taking both sections together, was still the stronger, and the Northern Democrats, temporarily severed as they were from their Southern brethren, would most assuredly have united with them in resisting any unconstitutional action on the part of the Republicans. If, then, it might be asked, slavery ran no risk of unconditional abolition, why should the Southern political leaders have acted with such extraordinary precipitation? Why, in a country in which, to all appearances, the two sections had been cordially united, should the advent to power of one political party have been the signal for so much disquietude on the part of the other? Had the presidential seat been suddenly usurped by an abolitionist tyrant of the type of Robespierre, the South could hardly have exhibited greater apprehension. Few Americans denied that a permanent union, such as had been designed by the founders of the Republic, was the best guarantee of prosperity and peace. And yet, because a certain number of misguided if well-meaning men clamoured for emancipation, the South chose to bring down in ruin the splendid fabric which their forefathers had constructed. In thus refusing to trust the good sense and fair dealing of the Republicans, it would seem, at a superficial glance, that the course adopted by the members of the new Confederacy, whether legitimate or not, could not possibly be justified. Unfortunately, something more than mere political rancour was at work. The areas of slave and of free labour were divided by an artificial frontier. Mason and Dixon's line, originally fixed as the boundary between Pennsylvania on the north and Virginia and Maryland on the south, cut the territory of the United States into two distinct sections. And, little by little, these two sections, geographically as well as politically severed, had resolved themselves into what might almost be termed two distinct nations. Many circumstances tended to increase the cleavage. The South was purely agricultural. The most prosperous part of the North was purely industrial. In the South, the great planters formed a landed aristocracy. The claims of birth were ungrudgingly admitted. Class barriers were, to a certain extent, a recognized part of the social system, and the sons of the old houses were accepted as the natural leaders of the people. In the North, on the contrary, the only aristocracy was that of wealth, and even wealth, apart from merit, had no hold on the respect of the community. The distinctions of caste were slight in the extreme. The descendants of the Puritans, of those English country gentlemen who had preferred to ride with Cromwell rather than with Rupert, to pray with Baxter rather than with Laud, made no parade of their ancestry, and among the extreme Republicans existed an innate but decided aversion to the recognition of social grades. Moreover, divergent interests demanded different fiscal treatment. The cotton and tobacco of the South, monopolizing the markets of the world, asked for free trade. The manufacturers of New England, struggling against foreign competition, were strong protectionists, and they were powerful enough to enforce their will in the shape of an oppressive tariff. Thus, the planters of Virginia paid high prices in order that mills might flourish in Connecticut, and the sovereign states of the South, to their own detriment, were compelled to contribute to the abundance of the wealthier North. The interests of labour were not less conflicting. The competition between free and forced labour, side by side on the same continent, was bound in itself sooner or later to breed dissension, and if it had not yet reached an acute stage, it had at least created a certain degree of bitter feeling. But more than all, and the fact must be borne in mind if the character of the Civil War is to be fully appreciated, the natural ties which should have linked together the states on either side of Mason and Dixon's line had weakened to a mere mechanical bond. The intercourse between North and South, social or commercial, was hardly more than that which exists between two foreign nations. The two sections knew but little of each other, and that little was not the good points, but the bad. For more than 50 years after the election of the first president, while as yet the crust of European tradition overlaid the young shoots of democracy, the supremacy, social and political, of the great landowners of the South had been practically undisputed. But when the young republic began to take its place amongst the nations, men found that the wealth and talents which led it forward belonged as much to the busy cities of New England as to the plantations of Virginia and the Carolinas, and with the growing sentiment in favour of universal equality began the revolt against the dominion of a caste. Those who had carved out their own fortunes by sheer hard work and ability questioned the superiority of men whose positions were no guarantee of personal capacity, and whose wealth was not of their own making. Those who had borne the heat and burden of the day deemed themselves the equals and more than equals of those who had loitered in the shade, and esteeming men for their own worth and not for that of some forgotten ancestor, they had come to despise those who toiled, not neither did they spin. Tenaciously, the Southerners clung to the supremacy they had inherited from a bygone age. The contempt of the Northerner was repaid in kind. In the political arena, the struggle was fierce and keen. Mutual hatred, fanned by unscrupulous agitators, increased in bitterness, and hindering reconciliation, rose the fatal barrier of slavery. It is true that prior to 1860, the abolitionists were not numerous in the North, and it is equally true that by many of the best men in the South the institution which had been bequeathed to them was thoroughly detested. Looking back over the years which have elapsed since the slaves were freed, the errors of the two factions are sufficiently manifest. If, on the one hand, the abolitionist, denouncing sternly, in season and out of season, the existence of slavery on the free soil of America, was unjust and worse to the slave owner, who, to say the least, was in no way responsible for the inhuman and short-sighted policy of a former generation. On the other hand, the high-principled Southerner, although in his heart deploring the condition of the Negro and sometimes imitating the example of Washington, whose dying bequest gave freedom to his slaves, made no attempt to find a remedy. The latter had the better excuse. He knew, were emancipation granted, that years must elapse before the Negro could be trained to the responsibilities of freedom, and that those years would impoverish the South. It appears to have been forgotten by the abolitionists that all races upon earth have required a protracted probation to fit them for the rights of citizenship and the duties of free men. Here was a people, hardly emerged from the grossest barbarism, and possibly from the very beginning of inferior natural endowment, on whom they proposed to confer the same rights without any probation whatsoever. A glance at the world around them should have induced reflection. The experience of other countries was not encouraging. Haiti, where the blacks had long been masters of the soil, was still a pandemonium, and in Jamaica and South Africa the precipitate action of zealous but unpractical philanthropists had wrought incalculable mischief. Even Lincoln himself, redemption by purchase being impracticable, saw no other way out of the difficulty than the wholesale deportation of the Negroes to West Africa. In time, perhaps, under the influence of such men as Lincoln and Lee, the nation might have found a solution of the problem, and North and South have combined to rid their common country of the curse of human servitude. But between fanaticism on the one side and helplessness on the other, there was no common ground. The fierce invectives of the reformers forbade all hope of temperate discussion, and their unreasoning denunciations only provoked resentment. And this resentment became the more bitter because in demanding emancipation, either by fair means or forcible, and in expressing their intention of making it a national question, the abolitionists were directly striking at a right which the people of the South held sacred. It had never been questioned hitherto that the several states of the Union, so far at least as concerned their domestic institutions, were each and all of them, under the Constitution, absolutely self-governing. But the threats which the Black Republicans held out were tantamount to a proposal to set the Constitution aside. It was their Charter of Liberty, therefore, and not only their material prosperity, which the states that first seceded believed to be endangered by Lincoln's election. Ignorant of the temper of the great mass of the Northern people, as loyal in reality to the Constitution as themselves, they were only too ready to be convinced that the denunciations of the abolitionists were the first presage of the storm that was presently to overwhelm them, to reduce their states to provinces, to wrest from them the freedom they had inherited, and to make them hewers of wood and drawers of water to the detested plutocrats of New England. But the gravamen of the indictment against the Southern people is not that they seceded, but that they seceded in order to preserve and to perpetuate slavery, or, to put it more forcibly, that the liberty to enslave others was the right which most they valued. This charge, put forward by the abolitionists in order to cloak their own revolt against the Constitution, is true as regards a certain section, but as regards the South as a nation, it is quite untenable, for 3/4 of the population derived rather injury than benefit from the presence in their midst of 4 million serfs. Had slavery continued, the system of labour, says General Grant, would soon have impoverished the soil and left the country poor. The non-slaveholder must have left the country, and the small slaveholder have sold out to his more fortunate neighbour. The slaves neither bought nor sold. Their wants were supplied almost entirely by their own labour, and the local markets of the South would have drawn far larger profit from a few thousand white labourers than they did from the multitude of Negroes. It is true that a party in the South, more numerous perhaps among the political leaders than among the people at large, was averse to emancipation under any form or shape. There were men who looked upon their bondsmen as mere beasts of burden, more valuable but hardly more human than the cattle in their fields, and who would not only have perpetuated but have extended slavery. There were others who conscientiously believed that the Negro was unfit for freedom, that he was incapable of self-improvement, and that he was far happier and more contented as a slave. Among these were ministers of the gospel, in no small number, who, appealing to the Old Testament, preached boldly that the institution was of divine origin, that the coloured race had been created for servitude, and that to advocate emancipation was to impugn the wisdom of the Almighty. But there were still others, including many of those who were not slave owners, who, while they acquiesced in the existence of an institution for which they were not personally accountable, looked forward to its ultimate extinction by the voluntary action of the states concerned. It was impossible as yet to touch the question openly, for the invectives and injustice of the abolitionists had so wrought upon the Southern people that such action would have been deemed a base surrender to the dictation of the enemy. But they trusted to time, to the spread of education, and to a feeling in favour of emancipation which was gradually pervading the whole country. The opinions of this party, with which it may be said the bulk of the Northern people was in close sympathy, are perhaps best expressed in a letter written by Colonel Robert Lee, the head of one of the oldest families in Virginia, a large landed proprietor and slaveholder, and the same officer who had won such well-deserved renown in Mexico. "In this enlightened age," wrote the future General-in-Chief of the Confederate Army, "there are few, I believe, but will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. I think it a greater evil to the white than to the coloured race, and while my feelings are strongly interested in the latter, my sympathies are more deeply engaged for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa. morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare them for better things. How long their subjection may be necessary is known and ordered by a merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than from the storms and contests of fiery controversy. This influence, though slow, is sure. The doctrines and miracles of our Saviour have required nearly 2,000 years to convert but a small part of the human race, and even among Christian nations what gross errors still exist. While we see the course of the final abolition of slavery is still onward, and we give it the aid of our prayers and all justifiable means in our power, we must leave the progress as well as the result in His hands, who sees the end and who chooses to work by slow things, and with whom 1,000 years are but as a single day. The abolitionist must know this, and must see that he has neither the right nor the power of operating except by moral means and suasion. If he means well to the slave, he must not create angry feelings in the master. Although he may not approve of the mode by which it pleases Providence to accomplish its purposes, the result will nevertheless be the same, and the reason he gives for interference in what he has no concern holds good for every kind of interference with our neighbours when we disapprove of their conduct. With this view of the question, Jackson was in perfect agreement. "I am very confident," says his wife, "that he would never have fought for the sole object of perpetuating slavery. He found the institution a responsible and troublesome one, and I have heard him say that he would prefer to see the Negroes free, but he believed that the Bible taught that slavery was sanctioned by the Creator himself, who maketh all men to differ, and instituted laws for the bond and free. He therefore accepted slavery, as it existed in the South, not as a thing desirable in itself, but as allowed by Providence for ends which it was not his business to determine. It may perhaps be maintained that to have had no dealings with the accursed thing, and to have publicly advocated some process of gradual emancipation, would have been the nobler course. But setting aside the teaching of the churches and the bitter temper of the time, it should be remembered that slavery, although its hardships were admitted, presented itself in no repulsive aspect to the people of the Confederate States. They regarded it with feelings very different from those of the abolitionists, whose acquaintance with the condition they reprobated was small in the extreme. The lot of the slaves, the Southerners were well aware, was far preferable to that of the poor and the destitute of great cities, of the victims of the sweater and the inmates of fever dens. The helpless Negro had more hands to succor him in Virginia than the starving white man in New England. The children of the plantation enjoyed a far brighter existence than the children of the slums. The worn and feeble were maintained by their masters, and the black labourer, looking forward to an old age of ease and comfort among his own people, was more fortunate than many a northern artisan. Moreover, the brutalities ascribed to the slave owners as a class were of rare occurrence. The people of the South were neither less humane nor less moral than the people of the North or of Europe, and it is absolutely inconceivable that men of high character and women of gentle nature should have looked with leniency on cruelty, or have failed to visit the offender with something more than reprobation. Had the calumnies which were scattered broadcast by the abolitionists possessed more than a vestige of truth, men like Lee and Jackson would never have remained silent. In the minds of the northern people, slavery was associated with atrocious cruelty and continual suffering. In the eyes of the Southerners, on the other hand, it was associated with great kindness and the most affectionate relations between the planters and their bondsmen. And if the Southerners were blind, it is most difficult to explain the remarkable fact that throughout the war, although thousands of plantations and farms, together with thousands of women and children, all of whose male relatives were in the Confederate armies, were left entirely to the care of the Negroes, both life and property were perfectly secure. Such, then, was the attitude of the South towards slavery. The institution had many advocates, uncompromising and aggressive, but taking the people as a whole it was rather tolerated than approved, and even if no evidence to the contrary were forthcoming, we should find it hard to believe that a civilized community would have plunged into revolution in order to maintain it. There can be no question but that secession was revolution, and revolutions, as has been well said, are not made for the sake of greased cartridges. To bring about such unanimity of purpose as took possession of the whole South, such passionate loyalty to the new Confederacy, such intense determination to resist coercion to the bitter end, needed some motive of unusual potency, and the perpetuation of slavery was not a sufficient motive. The great bulk of the population neither owned slaves nor was connected with those who did. Many favoured emancipation, and the working men, a rapidly increasing class, were distinctly antagonistic to slave labour. Moreover, the Southerners were not only warmly attached to the Union, which they had done so much to establish, but their pride in their common country, in its strength, its prestige, and its prosperity, was very great. Why, then, should they break away? History supplies us with a pertinent example.